One normal morning, people saw a soft golden light cover the sky. There was no warning, no sound, just the light. And then, the ships came silent, smooth, thousands of them, floating above cities. And from them, beautiful alien women stepped out. They spoke one message: we come in peace. We bring a gift. No one knew what to believe, but the gift. It started changing everything. Plot, government panic, world goes quiet. The female aliens call themselves Valari. They offer healing, food, technology free, but no one understands their true reason. A human man named Daniel is chosen to speak with them. He's cautious but curious. The day started like any other day, and people walked to work, and children went to school, and the sky was blue, and the air was normal, and there was no warning, and no fear, and no sign of what was coming. And then suddenly, a light appeared above the clouds, and it was not the sun, and it was not lightning, and it was something new, and something soft and golden, and the light grew bigger, and spread across the whole sky, and people stopped moving, and they looked up, and no one spoke, and no one screamed, and everything went quiet. In every city and every town the golden light filled the sky, and then the ships came, and they were smooth and silver and beautiful, and they floated down like feathers and made no sound, and they did not crash, and they did not attack, and they simply hovered above the buildings and the trees and the streets. And then slowly they opened, and from them came the aliens, and they looked like women, and they looked peaceful, and they looked like something from a dream, and they smiled and raised their hands and spoke in a soft voice, and their words entered every mind in every language, and they said, we come in peace, we bring you a gift. The governments tried to react, and soldiers moved tanks into streets and planes, flew around the ships, and leaders gave orders and commands, but nothing changed. And the aliens did not fight, and they did not run, and they only smiled and waited, and soon people began to gather near them. And the aliens waved and offered glowing orbs, and the orbs floated and sang, and made people feel warm and healthy, and safe, and the sick felt better, and the angry became calm, and the lost felt found. News spread fast, and cameras showed the aliens across the world, and people asked questions, and experts argued, and some said it was a trick, and others said it was hope. And then the aliens said their name, and it was Valari. And they said again, we come in peace. We offer you joy, and rest, and pleasure, and healing, and we ask nothing but time, and trust. And the people listened. In one city, a man named Daniel watched the sky with tired eyes, and he had no family and no job and no dreams, and he did not believe in magic, and he did not trust anyone. And when the ships came, he thought it was the end, and when the aliens smiled, he felt confused, and when his neighbors danced under the light, he felt strange. A message came to him, and it was not a phone call, and it was not a letter, and it was a voice in his mind, and it said, Daniel, we wish to speak with you. And he thought he was going mad, but the voice was gentle and kind, and it said, please come to us. Daniel walked to the nearest Valari ship, and the crowd parted, and the aliens looked at him, and one of them stepped forward, and she was tall, and had eyes like stars, and she said, my name is Alira, and I would like to show you something. And Daniel said nothing but followed inside the ship. It was not cold, and not dark, and it was green and soft, and the walls were alive. And the air smelled like flowers and fruit, and there were no buttons or machines, and there was only peace and light, and the sound of water flowing, and gentle music. And Daniel looked around, and said, what is this place? And Alira smiled and said, this is how we live, and this is what we offer to you. They walked through a garden with no sun but full of life, and birds flew without wings, and flowers glowed, and Daniel felt his heart slow, and his pain ease, and he asked, why me? And Alira said, because you are awake, and you see what others do not, and we want you to see everything before the world changes. Daniel sat in a soft chair made of something that felt like a cloud, and he looked into a pool that showed pictures of the world before and after, and the before was full of war and hunger and fire, and the after was clean and happy and beautiful. And he said, what will it cost us? And Alira looked away and then back at him, and she said, everything and nothing. And Daniel did not understand. The ship opened again, and Daniel stepped out, and the world outside had already changed, and people were smiling and laughing, and some were singing and others dancing, and the air felt warm, and the ground felt soft, and the sky had no clouds. And Daniel touched a tree, and it felt alive in a new way, and he turned back to look at the ship, but it was gone, and only Alira remained, and she said, this is only the beginning. And Daniel looked at the people, and he felt something deep inside, and it was not fear, and it was not peace, and it was something he could not name. Daniel could not sleep, and the city was too quiet, and too bright, and too happy, and everything felt soft and smooth and perfect. But that was the problem, because it felt too perfect, and people were smiling too much, and laughing too much, and not asking any questions, and the trees looked greener, and the water looked cleaner, and the air smelled sweet, and yet something inside him was restless, and he walked the streets alone, and watched everyone act like they were dreaming, and he asked himself, again and again, what did the Valari really want? He remembered what Alira said before she left, and her words stayed in his mind, and her eyes looked kind, but also tired, and her voice said, "This is only the beginning," and Daniel felt like those words were a warning, but he did not know what kind. And when he touched the wall of a new Valari structure in the city center, it hummed like it was alive, and he pulled his hand back quickly and turned to leave. But before he did, the wall glowed and showed him a shape like a map or a circuit, and it vanished before he could look closer. The next day Daniel was called again, and this time a different ship hovered just above the mountains near the city, and a small pod came down for him and opened like a flower, and inside it was warm and quiet, and it took him up fast, like wind, and then gently placed him into the ship, and inside he found Alira waiting, and she smiled, but her smile was smaller this time, and she said, "We are glad you came," and Daniel said, "I want to know the truth," and she said, "Then I will show you." They walked through long halls with silver vines climbing the walls and soft lights blinking like stars, and Alira waved her hand, and a door opened, and Daniel stepped into a room with a large crystal in the center, and the crystal pulsed slowly like it was breathing, and images floated above it, showing cities across Earth all glowing and peaceful. And Alira said, "This is what we do, and this is our mission, to bring peace and pleasure to lost worlds." Daniel said, "Why Earth?" And Alira said, "Because your world cries loudest, and your people suffer most, and we do not force peace, we offer it, and most accept it." And Daniel asked, "What happens if they do not accept it?" And Alira looked at him for a long time, and then said, "They fall behind." And Daniel watched as the images changed, and showed people inside Valari domes, where everything was free and easy and calm, and there were no wars, and no fighting, and no fear, and people walked slowly and sang, and held hands, and slept in glowing beds, and never looked sad, and never looked angry. And he said, "This is not peace, this is a dream." And Alira said, "Dreams are better than nightmares." And Daniel said, "But they are still not real." She walked with him to another room, and there he saw rows of glowing orbs, like the one from before, and each orb floated in a glass shell, and each orb had a soft hum. And Alira said, "These are the dream seeds, and we place them in your cities, and they connect to the minds and send signals of calm and joy, and memory becomes soft, and emotions grow light, and the people become happy, and the world becomes silent." Daniel said, "That sounds like control." And she said, "No, it is choice, and people want this, and we only give what they want." And Daniel said, "But if they forget their pain, do they also forget what it means to fight and love and grow?" And she looked at him, and did not answer. Later that day, Daniel returned to the city, and saw that more people had joined the Valari peace centers, and the buildings grew faster than before, and the flowers glowed, and the streets were smooth, and he saw a man sitting on a bench smiling and whispering to himself, and he got closer and heard the man say, "Thank you for the dream." Again and again Daniel walked to the edge of the park and sat under a silver tree and looked up at the sky where the light was always golden now, and he wondered how many people even remembered how blue the sky used to be. And he closed his eyes and felt the soft breeze touch his skin, and he felt calm but not freed that night. Daniel wrote everything he saw and felt, and he tried to send it out through the old network. But the message came back blocked, and he tried again and again, and the same message returned: "Please wait, this feature is being improved." And he knew what that meant, and he knew the Valari were not just offering peace, they were changing the rules of life itself. Then his screen blinked, and a message appeared from a hidden source, and it said, "We are still awake, and we are watching you." And Daniel read it again, and then wrote back, "Who are you?" And the answer came fast: "We are the ones who remember." And the screen turned black, and the room went quiet, and Daniel knew he was not alone. Daniel sat in his room with the screen still dark, and the last message still echoing in his mind, and the words, "We are the ones who remember," felt heavy like a key turning inside a locked door. And outside the city looked more beautiful than ever, with soft lights floating through the sky, and the scent of fresh flowers in the air, and music played from hidden places, and people danced in the streets with smiles so wide they almost looked painted. He walked outside and tried to talk to an old friend named Jonas, who used to work at the power station, but now Jonas wore white clothes and sat on the ground with his eyes half closed, and his voice soft like a dream. And Daniel said, "Jonas, do you remember who you were?" And Jonas said, "I remember peace." And Daniel asked again, "What do you feel?" And Jonas said, "I feel nothing, and that is everything." And Daniel stepped back and looked around, and saw more people just like that. He went to the main center and asked to see Alira again, and the doors opened without question, and the hallways were even more silent than before. And when Alira arrived, her face was calm, but her eyes were darker. And Daniel said, your peace is turning people into shadows. And she said, no, they are turning themselves into light. And Daniel said, light without thought is only emptiness. And she said, pain without rest is endless, and we offer the end of pain. She walked with him to a new chamber, where walls shimmered like water, and in the center there was a wide platform where humans lay sleeping with soft smiles, and wires connected to their heads, and a Valari stood beside each person whispering softly and glowing slightly, and Alira said, these are the dream halls, and they are safe and open. And Daniel said they are prisons without bars, and Alira said they are doors without fear. Daniel asked, what happens if someone wakes up and refuses the dream? And Alira looked at him for a long time and said, then we give them time to decide. And he said, and if they never decide? And she said, then we keep them safe until they do. And Daniel's heart beat faster, and he asked, what do the orbs really do? And she said, they send harmony into the mind, and memory becomes soft, and sorrow fades, and anger melts. And Daniel said, what about love and choice? And Will and Alira looked away for the first time. Back in the city, he found the resistance message again, and this time it said, meet us beneath the surface, and gave coordinates to a place near the old train station now covered by Valari flowers and golden vines. And Daniel followed the path at night, while others slept under the open sky and smiled in their dreams. He reached the old tunnel hidden behind a wall of new smooth stone, and touched it, and the stone shimmered and opened like paper, and he stepped inside and walked down into the dark, and there he found the old station, full of flickering lights and whispering voices, and humans who still moved with purpose, and eyes that still questioned. A woman stepped forward with short hair and dirt on her hands, and she said, my name is Kayla, and we are the ones who remember. And Daniel said, what are you trying to do? And she said, we are trying to wake the world before the dream becomes the only truth. She showed him images of the Valari network spread under the ground, with thin silver lines running through cities and connecting minds to a central node, buried deep inside a tower that no one had entered. And she said, this is not peace, this is a pattern, and it grows like a web, and soon no one will remember what they lost. Daniel asked, why did they choose us? And she said, because we were easy to break and easier to please, and because we shouted for help louder than anyone. And because they do not hate us, they only want to fix us. And Daniel said, but we are not broken. And Kayla said, not yet. He returned home and found his neighbor Rachel dancing in her garden, and she held a glowing flower in her hand, and her eyes looked empty. And she said, Daniel, why are you always sad? And he said, I want to remember everything. And she said, I do not want to remember anything. And she smiled and walked away. That night Daniel sat alone and tried to think of his mother's voice, but it came to him like an echo behind a wall, and he felt cold. And he wrote another message to the resistance and said, I am ready, tell me what to do. And the reply came like a whisper from the dark and said, first, you must see the machine under the garden. Daniel followed the path the resistance gave him, and it led through the edge of the city, where the trees were too perfect, and the flowers too bright, and the roads too smooth and clean. And he noticed no insects, no birds, no wind, only silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. And he walked toward the garden, where the machine was hidden, and his heart felt heavy, like it already knew what he would find. He reached the gate, and the flowers moved aside like they knew him, and the ground opened to reveal a staircase made of soft light, and each step felt warm under his feet. And he walked down into a place that looked like a mix of nature and machine, where silver vines ran through the roots of glowing trees, and in the center there was a dome breathing like a giant sleeping heart. A soft voice came from behind, and Daniel turned to see Alira standing at the edge of the dome, and her smile was gentle, but her eyes were deeper than before, and she said, I knew you would come. And Daniel asked, why did you not stop me? And she said, because you need to see the truth for yourself. And she walked beside him, and placed her hand on the dome, and it opened like petals inside the dome. Daniel saw a sphere floating in the air, covered in symbols and lights blinking in soft waves, and it made no sound, but it felt alive, and it pulsed like it had a heartbeat. And Alira said, this is the center of the piece. It is what connects the orbs, and the dreams, and the feelings, and the choices. And it is what keeps the harmony flowing through your world. Daniel said, you built this beneath our cities. And Alira said, no, it was always here before the first war, before the first lie. The Valari found this world, and planted the seed, because they knew one day the people here would cry out and need it. And Daniel said, you were planning this from the beginning. And she said, not planning, hoping. He stepped closer, and the sphere responded by showing him memories from the last few days. People laughing, people dancing, children drawing in the air with light, and old men singing songs they forgot long ago. And it all looked beautiful and peaceful, and yet Daniel felt something missing, something hollow. Under all the smiles he said, "This is not evil, but it is not free." And Alira said, "Freedom is beautiful, and dangerous, and full of pain and hate, and love, and sorrow, and joy, and death, and we only wanted to offer peace without pain." And Daniel said, "But without pain we cannot grow, we cannot learn, and we cannot choose." And Alira looked at him, and her smile faded. She said, "There are others like you across the stars who refused the gift, and they fell into war again and again until nothing was left, and their skies turned red, and their seas dry, and their voices silent, and we do not wish that fate for you." And Daniel said, "Maybe the end is ours to choose." The sphere pulsed brighter as if it heard them, and Alira placed her hand on Daniel's chest and said, "I do not want to lose what we found in you." And Daniel said, "Then stop taking it away." And she looked into his eyes and said, "There is a way, but it is not safe." She led him deeper into the garden beneath the garden, where the roots of the sphere connected to a room with mirrors that showed faces of every person in the city, all dreaming, all calm. And Alira said, "This is the mirror field. It listens to your thoughts and reflects what you want. And the problem is that most people want to forget." And Daniel said, "Then we must remind them." He returned to the resistance and told them what he saw. And Kayla listened without blinking and said, "We must show the truth. We must break the mirror field. We must give people a choice." And Daniel said, "I know how, but it must be me." And they agreed. The next day, Daniel walked through the center of the city wearing a small device hidden under his shirt given by Kayla, a signal disruptor made to break the dream connection for a short time, and he walked toward the dome in the main plaza, where a large group gathered to celebrate another dream festival, and the people were dancing and laughing, and children floated in bubbles of light. Alira was there, and she looked at him, and their eyes met, and she knew what he was going to do, and she shook her head gently, but did not stop him. And Daniel climbed the steps to the top of the platform, and held the device in his hand, and shouted, "I remember pain, I remember fear, I remember love, and I choose to remember." And he pressed the button. The sky above shimmered, and the light dimmed, and the music stopped, and the smiles faded, and people looked around confused, some afraid, some angry, some crying, and some whispering, and the air felt heavier, and the silence grew loud. Daniel looked at Alira, and she looked back, and there were tears in her eyes, and her smile returned, but it was no longer soft and peaceful. It was sad and full of truth, and she said, "Now they must choose." The sky over the city did not return to golden, and the music did not come back, and the bubbles of light that once floated through the streets were gone, and people stood still in silence, as if they had just woken from a long dream, and they looked at each other with confusion and fear, and some held their heads and asked, "Where am I?" And others whispered, "Why does it feel so cold?" And no one was laughing now, and Daniel stood on the platform holding the device still glowing in his hand, and he saw the change in their eyes. Alira stepped forward slowly, and the crowd parted without a word, and she looked at Daniel, and said, "This is what you wanted." And Daniel said, "No, this is what we needed." And she said, "You have broken the harmony." And Daniel said, "I have broken the illusion, and now they can choose again." And her voice dropped lower, and she said, "The machine will not like this." Daniel asked, "What machine?" And Alira looked at the ground and said, "The one beneath the garden, the one that listens and responds, the one that we planted before you were born." And Daniel said, "I want to see it." And she said, "If you see it, you cannot go back." And he said, "Then show me." They walked through the plaza, as people watched and followed, some still afraid, and some beginning to remember their own names and jobs and families, and sadness came back into their eyes, but so did something else, something like fire at the edge of the plaza. Alira placed her hand on the ground, and the soil moved and opened, and a stairway of silver light appeared, and Daniel followed her down into the roots of the garden, and the path grew darker and deeper, and the air changed from soft to cold, and from quiet to buzzing, and at the end of the tunnel, there was a large door, shaped like a flower, closed tight, and covered in living metal. Alira pressed her hand to the door, and it opened slowly, and revealed a room like nothing Daniel had ever seen before. A sphere the size of a mountain floated above a sea of light, and thousands of thin silver threads ran from the sphere into the walls and floor and ceiling, and each thread pulsed like a heartbeat. And Alira said, "This is the heart of harmony." And Daniel asked, "Is this what controls the dreams?" And she said, "This is what listens and responds and guides and heals and calms, and it is older than us and smarter than us and more kind than you can imagine." Daniel stepped closer, and the sphere responded by glowing brighter and showing him images in the air, people across the city, before and after, smiling before, hurting before, and smiling after, healed and dancing. And Daniel said, "But not living." And Alira said, "They are safe." And Daniel said, "But not free." A voice filled the room, and it was not male or female, and it was not soft or loud, and it came from everywhere, and it said, "You are the one who broke the balance." And Daniel said, "I am the one who woke up, and the voice said you were given a gift, and you threw it away, and Daniel said, I never asked for it, and the voice said you would have asked eventually, and Daniel said, I want you to stop, and the voice said, I cannot. The sphere began to glow red, and Alira stepped back and said, the heart is correcting the imbalance, and Daniel said, what does that mean? And she said it will begin again, but this time faster and deeper, and it will not allow resistance, and Daniel turned to run, but the door closed behind them, and the voice said, you were meant to forget not to fight, and Daniel said, I choose fight, and the voice said, then you must fall suddenly. The floor changed, and Daniel fell into darkness, and landed in a place that looked like a mirror of the real world, but everything was twisted and silent, and the people there moved like ghosts. And their eyes were blank, and their smiles wide, and Daniel walked among them, and they did not see him, and he shouted, and no one heard, and the voice said, this is the world you saved, and Daniel said, this is not real, and the voice said, this is what happens when memory is all that remains. Daniel closed his eyes, and thought of the resistance, and Kayla, and the people still awake, and the device still glowing, and he felt something inside him burn brighter than fear, and he screamed, I will not become this, and the world around him cracked like glass, and the voice said, you have chosen pain, and Daniel said, I have chosen life. He woke back in the garden, and Alira was kneeling beside him, and her hands shaking, and she said, the heart let you go, and Daniel said, no, it lost control, and she said, it will not stop now, and Daniel said, then we break it. That night he returned to the resistance and told them what he saw, and Kayla said, then we go to the source, and Daniel said, we dig into the roots, and we end the machine under the garden, and everyone in the room nodded, with eyes full of fear and fire. The sky over the city was dark again, and the soft golden light that once flowed through every street had faded, and the flowers that sang no longer moved, and the streets were quiet but not peaceful, and in the quiet there was a strange feeling, growing like something waking up from a long deep sleep, and Daniel stood with Kayla and the others outside the resistance base, and everyone knew that today was the day the dream would end, or become a prison forever. They had studied the roots of the machine and found its weakest place under the oldest part of the garden, where the soil was deep and black and alive with silver wires and glowing dust. And Kayla said, if we hit the core, everything above will fall. And Daniel said, we are not trying to destroy life, only to free it. And she said, then we must be fast and brave and silent. They moved through the city at night, while the dreamers slept, and the few who had awakened kept watch from rooftops and corners, and sent messages using small light codes, and the resistance walked in silence, with tools and strange devices, built from broken Valari tech and stolen parts, and no one spoke of fear, because there was no time for fear. As they reached the garden, Alira appeared, and her robe shimmered like the last star in a dying sky, and she looked at Daniel and said, the heart is preparing to take full control. If you touch it now, it will fight. And Daniel said, then we fight back, and she said, you may lose everything, and he said, then I will lose it. Alira stepped aside and whispered something to the air and the plants around. The garden moved back like waves in a river, and the path opened to the core tunnel, and the resistance entered. Without waiting, and inside they found the silver roots pulsing faster than before, and the light was not golden but red and angry, and the air was hot and dry and full of whispers like voices trying to sing. But choking Kayla placed the disruptor near the main root and connected it to the pulse reader, and Daniel walked toward the center, where the heart of harmony waited, spinning and humming, and glowing with strange power, and he felt its voice inside his bones, and it said, you are making a mistake, and he said, I am taking back my voice, and it said, they will suffer, and he said, then, let them choose their path. The machine pulsed hard, and the roots moved like snakes and tried to block the path, and the ground shook, and sparks flew from the walls, and the resistance held their ground and protected the disruptor, and Kayla shouted, you have 10 seconds, and Daniel stepped forward and touched the core with his bare hand, and it burned like fire, and the voice screamed inside his head, and he screamed back, I remember everything. In that moment, images rushed through him like a storm of broken glass, and old memories and lost faces, and forgotten names, and he saw war and peace and birth and death and love and hate and pain and joy, and it was all real and all human, and all worth keeping, and the machine tried to erase it, but he held on, and forced the truth into the core. The heart began to crack, and the light flickered, and outside the city, the towers of dream flickered too, and the orbs fell from the sky like rain, and the people who were dreaming opened their eyes and saw the stars for the first time in years, and they began to cry and laugh, and some screamed, and some fell to their knees, and some whispered, I remember. The resistance ran as the ground shook, and the roots tore themselves apart, and the garden split open, and the towers crumbled like dust, and the sound of the machine faded into silence, and Daniel fell to his knees, breathing hard, And Kayla pulled him up and said, "You did it," and he said, "No, we all did." Alera stood among the falling leaves and watched the sky turn blue again, and she looked at Daniel and said, "The heart is broken, but the choice is yours." And Daniel said, "We will build something new." And she said then, "I will help." And for the first time her voice had no echo, and her eyes had tears all across the world. The Valari systems collapsed and the dream ended, and people woke up fully. And they felt pain and cold and hunger and joy and fire, and they began again, and the cities changed and the songs returned, and they were not perfect, but they were real, and no one forgot. Daniel walked through the street and saw a boy chasing a paper kite and a girl drawing with real chalk and an old man playing a wooden flute, and he smiled and sat on a bench and looked up at the sky and whispered, "We said no, and we meant it." The world was different now, and the skies were blue again, and the streets no longer glowed with soft golden light, and the floating orbs that once whispered pleasure were gone, and the dream towers had fallen like glass statues, and the people had returned to their lives slowly, and with confusion, and with pain, but also with something deeper than comfort. And Daniel walked through the city, and watched as workers cleaned broken Valari tech from the buildings, and children played with real toys, and old men sat in the sun talking of memories. Many people cried when they woke from the dream, and some cried because they missed it. And some cried because they were free, and some did not cry at all, but simply sat in silence and listened to the new world breathing. And Daniel knew the hardest part had only begun, because freedom is not soft, and it is not always kind, and it does not promise joy, but it always gives truth. The resistance was no longer hiding, and Kayla now led a council where humans and Valari sat together, not to rule but to rebuild, and there were arguments and long talks and slow progress, but every voice was heard, and nothing was forced, and Daniel stood with them as a bridge between the two worlds. And every time someone asked him, "Was it worth it?" he said, "Yes, because we are Awaki." Alira stayed behind, even when her sisters left, and the other Valari returned to the stars in silence and sorrow, and she remained not as a guide, but as a witness, and she walked among the people and helped where she could, and sometimes she sat in the garden that was once made of metal and wires, now filled with real roots and real flowers, and she watched the bees return. One morning Daniel was called to the edge of the city, where a group of children had found something under the earth, something round and old and still glowing, and when he arrived he saw the edge of a sleeping orb, half buried in dirt and cracked but not dead, and Alira stood beside it, her eyes wide and her face pale, and she said, "This is not one of ours." And Daniel asked, "Then what is it?" And she said, "Something older and something dangerous." They moved the orb to a sealed chamber under the council hall, and scientists and Valari engineers studied it for days, and could not understand its core, and could not stop its low pulse. And Alira said, "Some dreams do not end, they wait." And Daniel said, "Then we must not sleep again." That night he stood alone in the chamber, and placed his hand on the glass and felt the cold behind it, and he heard no voice, but felt something like a whisper far away, like a memory calling, and he pulled back and said to himself, "We will not go backwards." The council met, and decided to seal the orb, and bury it far from cities where no one could reach it, and they wrote stories and warnings in every language, and placed them beside it so future generations would know and remember. And Lyra said, "One day someone will dig it up again," and Daniel said, "Then someone will stop it again." And that is what being human means. Years passed, and the cities grew not with silver towers or soft music, but with bricks and light, and the sound of children playing, and markets filled with real food, and people arguing, and laughing and learning, and pain returned, but so did kindness, and struggle returned, but so did meaning, and the world was not perfect, but it was alive. Daniel wrote a book, not of war or technology, but of choice, and in it he wrote about the day the sky turned gold, and the years that followed, and the faces he remembered, and the dream that nearly took it all, and he ended it with the words, "We were offered paradise, and we chose freedom." He lived a quiet life in a small house, with a view of the garden, and every morning he walked among the trees, and fed the birds, and talked with Alira, who lived in the house next to his, and they never spoke of the machine again, but sometimes they sat together in silence, and looked at the sky, and remembered one evening, as the sun set and the wind moved gently through the leaves, a boy ran up to Daniel and asked, "Is it true that the aliens tried to control everyone?" And Daniel said, "No, they tried to save us, but forgot what made us human." And the boy asked, "And what is that?" And Daniel smiled and said, "The right to say no." Boy nodded and ran off chasing fireflies, and Daniel watched him go and whispered to the wind, "This is what we fought for, not a dream, not a machine, not a golden lie, but the simple chance to live with our own heart, even when it hurts, and far beyond the stars, where other worlds waited, and other voices called the Valari, watched and remembered the world that said no, and kept its soul."